If there is a message for us today, I believe it is to learn to live from our heart in love. These short lessons, hopefully, will help to inspire you to live with purpose, love passionately, and inspire others. We are the change agent our world needs. I'm Helen Toews. Step into the river today with me to explore the mysteries of God. They are not hidden from us, but for us to discover. Because we are in the Yahweh, Friend or Foe, Part 3. And this will be the final one. My screen is going a little goofy. But I'm going to sort of wrap things up today in this. There's so many directions that we can go. Like last week, hopefully we grew in courage to begin to ask some hard questions, right? I've often wondered, for instance, why the Old Testament stories relay an entirely different story than the New Testament. Our challenge last week was to ask questions, personal, deep, mindful, goofy, or serious questions. And I hope you have. I hope you have. When we'll talk about that at the, when we come back to the Hollywood squares, as it were. But I hope that you are asking questions, and I know that I've received some correspondence and questions this week. I know this is a bit of a difficult subject, and because we have met Yahweh, the name Yahweh, in a completely different way than the questions that I'm asking right now. And I know for myself that for many years, I haven't been able to sort of take the Old Testament stories and put them alongside the New Testament Father, God, or the name of God that we know as Jesus refers to. And so I've had more questions than answers until I really, actually for the last 3 years now, when Kim and I started the What If Chronicles. And then some of you know that I've written a novel called Dancing Between Two Worlds. It's getting close to pushing the button. But I've had to ask some very, very interesting and serious questions. But you know what's happened in that time is that I've had to reset my thinking of what I've understood before. And I thought that it would be very confusing, it isn't what I thought it would be. And I'm feeling as I'm learning to reset my thinking of what I've understood before, that it's becoming easier to not look back, but to move forward with any new revelation or any new thoughts that I'm learning, and I'm learning it in that secret place, in that place where you whatever the answer is, you have to come to that peace, and that's the best part of this process. That's another story. More than anything, it's personally given me courage to ask more questions rather than just get swept up in new terminology or trends, because my personal ultimate goal is to know God. And if you've been with us for the first two parts of this question, Yahweh, friend or foe, I'd like to fill you in on where I personally have landed. I did it. I'm doing this session in the way of taking my question and then dealing with the question. So here's my first question. Are there any ancient writings that help us to understand the Hebrew God Yahweh? And I'm going to reply not by saying I have an answer, but again, I have thoughts about the question that seems to be evolving. what I it's like anything. You learn a little bit and you put your focus and there's more and more that comes in. So what I'm proposing is what I know right now is not right or wrong. There's certainly not dogmatic truths. I have simply started a process. And my research is telling me that at the time of Old Testament writings, ancient civilizations that were recorded in the Old Testament were surrounded by violent empires and harsh conditions. Their early view of God reflected their world: survival, war, conquest, and there were many myths that were entwined in their cultural and religious beliefs. And these beliefs were used to enforce loyalty to a sovereign, whether that God was mythological or actual part of their worship. They worship many gods, and we can see some clues that were hidden that actually are right in our Old Testament. In Joshua, I'm talking about the ancient ones, even before Joshua, in what I'm talking about now. But I'm taking us now into the Old Testament, where it says things like Joshua 24, where Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the river and served other gods. So the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't start with the God that we know. In Genesis 31, and when Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. Interesting, isn't it? In Genesis 35, so Jacob said to his household, "Put away the foreign gods." Another place in there it says, "They gave Jacob all the foreign gods they had, and Jacob hid them under the oak under Shechem." Wouldn't that be a good story to unpack? When when someone was told not uh, to worship foreign gods, and then he collected them all, he didn't throw them out. He didn't destroy them. He hid them under an oak tree. Other ancient sources and post-biblical Jewish traditions, like Genesis and the Book of Jubilees, they talk about there's other stories that we haven't maybe read unless you've been in these other books. That Abram's father Tetra is said to have been an idol maker, and one story tells about Abraham as a youth. He smashed the idols in his father's shop, which symbolizes his rejection of false gods. Though these are not canonical, these stories reflect how later Jewish thought remembered Abraham's conversion from polytheism, from more than believing in more than one God, to monotheism. Then I found I'm going to try to say it properly, the Ugaritic texts. One source that I found says that these Ugaritic texts are one of the most important discoveries for understanding the world behind, the Old Testament. These were clay tablets. They were written around 1400 to 1200 BCE. BCE is before uh, common era, before the time of Christ. It's the same. We used to use the term BC. And they opened an extraordinary window into some cultural environment that deeply influenced the Israelite religion and the Hebrew Bible. These were found in 1928. They were found by a farmer. It sounds like the Dead Sea Scrolls situation. And he found them in a tomb near Ras Shamara. And later they were excavated by an archaeologist named Claude Schaefer. I hadn't heard of any of these findings, and they were only 2 decades before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and we've all had probably some form of study or information on the Dead Sea Scrolls because they um, they these scrolls had a lot of our biblical books in them, as plus many more. But this Ugaritic is a Semitic language that's closely related to Hebrew, Aramaic, and Phoenician. And these clay tablets that were found were written in a unique cuneiform alphabet. Excuse me. And they were that were earlier than the other cuneiform, the symbols that create sound. When it was before the cuneiform alphabet was written just in signs, then the next level of that was when the symbols were brought into sound, sort of like when in the Hebrew, where the symbols of Yod, He, Vav, He were just illustrations and symbols. They received sounds. So this is what happened with these clay tablets, and these clay tablets in this form were one of the oldest alphabetic systems that were known. So these were really, really ancient texts. These contain myths and epics about Canaanite gods. They contained hymns, rituals, incantations. They also included letters, legal text, and royal correspondence. Two of the most famous in there are myths that are surrounding the belief of what are called the Baal cycle and the Epic of Keret, which are the central works of these texts. These these two myths that are so interesting because they describe a great many of the Canaanite deities and their relationships. And the Baal cycle is a series of mythic poems about the god Baal or Hadad, who are the storm and fertility deity. These texts in there describe the battles, victories, and relationships with other gods. So here's a sidebar. We all have understood that Baal was a god in the Old Testament. What I found from these writings is that Baal is a title, like Lord or Master. It's not a name. And Hadad is the personal name of the god. It is actually in our Old Testament. The Epic of Keret is one of the earliest stories about divine promise and moral failure. And they're important because the ideas are found in the Bible in the stories of Abraham, David, and Job. Both the Baal cycle and the Epic of Keret reveal how ancient Canaanites understood the divine world, how their gods were ruling and maintaining order and testing humanity. But these themes deeply influenced early Hebrew thought, laying a groundwork for how many familiar biblical ideas about covenant, divine justice, and renewal. My question was, why does all this matter? Well, possibly because both the Baal cycle and the epic, the myths that are in these tablets, show us that they may be the Canaanite worldview from which early Israelite religion came out of, where it emerged. They shared stories of divine kingship, cosmic order, death, resurrection, and the divine covenant. All of what was in there reflected in biblical stories that we know. And it was interesting, although Yahweh, the name Yahweh isn't mentioned, it shows how in later Hebrew texts that in our Bible, that Yahweh inherited and transformed attributes once attributed to both El and Baal. When scholars compared these with the Hebrew Bible, they realized the Israelites inherited much of their religious vocabulary, imagery, and structure from Canaanite culture. That was all written in these texts. Many psalms, prophetic poems echo the Ugaritic style. The Lord Baal Hadad is in the Old Testament depicted as a storm god, lord of rain, fertility, and war. Early Israel thought was that Yahweh takes over Baal's roles as the storm bringer and the chaos slayer. Even some biblical creation imagery of God subduing the sea or Leviathan mirrors these myths of Baal. One of Baal's titles is Rider of the Clouds. And in our Old Testament, this is applied to Yahweh. Yahweh rides the clouds, Psalm 68:4, subdues the seas, the Leviathan, in Psalms 74, Isaiah 27. This may show again how early Israelite religion didn't emerge in isolation. It evolved with the broader Canaanite spiritual world, and then it slowly reinterpreted its deities to a single representation of a god. So even there's no mention of Yahweh in the tablets, Israel's later depiction of Yahweh as a storm god, a warrior, a rider in the clouds, showed that this Yahweh clearly absorbed Baal's imagery. My question then is, so is it possible that Yahweh inherited the mythic roles of Baal Hadad or Baal, merging their traits into a single divine figure? Is that possible? If we think of these Ugaritic texts as prequel schools to the Bible, we may see into the symbolic and mythic stories from which the Hebrew stories were born. Several archaeological clues, inscriptions from Sinai and the southern Levant, suggest that Yahweh originated in the region of Midian or Edom, south of Israel, near where Moses lived in exile. And here we see it in Deuteronomy, texts like Deuteronomy 33. In Judges 5:4, they say, Yahweh came from Seir, he shone forth from Mount Paran. Question: is it possible that this indicates that Moses may have encountered Yahweh through Midianite priesthood Jethro, and could that be how the name Yahweh entered into the Israelite religion? Some questions are often best replied with more questions, so here they are for me. Is it possible that Yahweh is not the ancient universal source, but rather a later localized revelation of divinity? Is it possible that Yahweh became a frequency within the greater field the ancients called Elohim? So, more thoughts on that. The ancient tablets revealed a shared cultural and mythic heritage between Israel and its neighbors, a world in which divine councils, sea monsters, and cosmic battles were common imagery. Yahweh in the Old Testament is portrayed as a divine warrior, defeating chaos and establishing order in Canaanite Baal traditions. Exodus 15 says in the Song of the Sea that Yahweh was a warrior who overthrows Pharaoh using the waters of the Red Sea as his weapon, killing an army. He's also responsible for the plagues, for the death of firstborn, and all that we know out of Exodus. Habakkuk 3 describes Yahweh marching through the earth, crushing the nations and splitting the seas. In Psalm 74, the psalmist speaks of Yahweh, saying, you divided the sea by your might, you broke the heads of the dragons in the waters, you crushed the heads of Leviathan. Then in an older Septuagint Dead Sea Scroll version of Deuteronomy, verse 32, it mentions the sons of God, the Ben Elohim, allotted to the nations, with Yahweh taking Israel as his portion. So here's my question. If Yahweh takes Israel as his portion, meaning that that Israel now is his people, then does it imply that this God, a Ben Elohim, begins a separation of people groups? That's my question. Does this represent a God that brings unity? It seems very serious and hard to understand that God that we know would love one people group over another when the prayer we know from Jesus is, Father, that they be one as we are one. My next question, does this imply as well that Yahweh was one of the Ben Elohim? And my thoughts are, it seems to imply that Ben Elohim took rulership over Israel and was called Yahweh. Then the dive to explore this became easy, just much deeper. And I found out that in the earliest Hebrew and Near Eastern sources, Elohim does not begin as a single personal name for God, but as a plural descriptive term meaning divine beings, powers, or majestic ones. Over time, it came to express aspects or characteristics of the one God, especially in the Hebrew Bible as theology evolved toward monotheism. Elohim ties somehow into the name Yahweh. The word Elohim appears through the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and is the plural of Elo, God. Hebrew grammar often takes singular verbs when referring to the God of Israel that suggests plurality within unity. It starts right in Genesis 1:1, where it says, In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. Here, the text already presents Elohim as a singular creative consciousness. Elohim, we know, is plural. Create is the verb in the singular. The men who took the original scriptures and put them in our Bibles, they put it in as Elohim plurality, but then they put their own spin on it. And from there, the various church doctrines go as far as to tell us that this plurality infers a Trinity only, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So my question is, what if it isn't implying only three aspects or characteristics, but many? What if there's many, like 10, 20, 30, or maybe an infinite number of characteristics of God that we haven't understood yet? Genesis 1:26 says, then Elohim, plural, says, let us make man in our image after our likeness. The earliest texts describe Elohim less as a name and more as a collective expression of divine qualities. So the question again, could this be illustrating the creative intelligence of the field of consciousness, the source itself of God and its order in life? Another question, could this reflect the ancient idea that divinity manifests as a spectrum of attributes, each expressing a quality of the supreme source? As Israelite theology evolved, Elohim came to signify the total of divine powers, mind, will, and energy of the one source. For example, in Exodus 34, it describes Yod He Vav He's characteristics. Says God is merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Another question, does this describe the attributes of the God known as Yahweh in the Old Testament? The God who displays anger, vengeance, who murders, destroys, and brings confusion. You know, in the Jewish, I know there's a lot of information and very technical things, but when we start putting all these things together, it paints a whole different picture. from what some of us have understood. In Jewish mystical tradition, particularly in texts like the Sefer Yezirat, which is the book of creation, the Zohar, the book of splendor, it's called, the name Elohim is not viewed merely as a personal deity, but as a term that signifies the divine creative powers or structures through which the infinite, known as En Sof, manifests to the universe. You know that Ein Sof means just without end. So these powers are organized in an as and it's called the Sephirot, which is a system of 10 emanations or attributes of God. So let me try and make that just simple. There are Hebrew traditions and understanding of the word that we have for God. Elohim is not just a personal God singular, but it's an expression of all the attributes and the character of the Creator. That is what's coming out of these ancient books. To see all of these attributes and characteristics, they also have in the Kabbalah a design that reveals these attributes. In this mysticism of the Kabbalah, there are 10 interconnected emanations or attributes or characteristics that reveal and express God itself in creation. Each attribute represents a unique quality or mode of divine activity, and together they form a dynamic spiritual structure, the kind of divine anatomy that connects the infinite world with the finite world. This is a whole study on its own, but I'm going to give you the 10 attributes or the characteristics of the divine, and it is about who Jesus referred to and called Father. You'll recognize him because one of the words for him is crown, and which is the pure divine will, the source of all emanations, and represents the unknowable beginning of creation. Wisdom, our God is wisdom, is the spark of intuitive insight or creative ideas. He's understanding. He is the power of discernment and analysis, mercy, loving kindness, the outpouring of love, expansion, and generosity. He is strength, judgment, the force of restraint, discipline, and boundaries. He is beauty and harmony, the blending of love and strength into compassion and balance. He is victory and endurance, the energy of persistence, ambition, and forward momentum. He is glory, glorious, the quality of humility, surrender, and resonance with divine truth. He's the foundation, the channel that gathers and transmits all of the upper energies into manifestation, and it's associated with the connection and communication. And the last is about the kingdom. He is the kingdom, the final expression or vessel of all preceding energies that represent the material world, the Shekinah, the divine presence, and the realization of divine intention in creation. That is who he is. So the question is, what are they in relation to Elohim, where it says in the beginning, Elohim? When the Zohar and the Sefer Yezirat speak of Elohim as expressing through these names, they mean that the Elohim embodies the organized active forces of creation. It's not a singular personality, it's a plurality of divine powers working in perfect unity. So, in mystical thought, Elohim is God as the manifest structure of creation and has qualities and characteristics through which the infinite becomes knowable. And that means that the characteristics of the Elohim are the way that we can express the Father and how we know him. So, question, why did the very vengeful Yahweh God show up? So Yahweh was a warrior protector. So it made sense in a time when nations believed their gods fought for them. And it records that they had many gods and worshiped many idols. The God Yahweh was introduced with fierceness. It was seen as a sign of strength, not weakness, proof that Israel's God would defend them. Early texts like Exodus, Judges, Samuel show Yahweh acting like a national deity. And later, that Isaiah, Hosea, Micah reveal a moral awakening, and they prophesy to the people of a God that values justice, mercy, and love over sacrifice and war. It can appear confusing when the abject horror of some of the Yahweh stories are so abhorrent. But the Old Testament that we have in our lap often confuses people to believe that the Old and the New are illustrating the same God. I was one of those that was confused. And to make matters worse, today, many are reinforcing the belief that the Yahweh God of the Old Testament is the same as what Jesus speaks of. It seems that Hebrew thought and culture have taken precedence over other languages and is being taught that the Jews and Israel are chosen of God, and in so implying they're better than others. Last week, one of the challenges was to ask the hard questions. I had so many questions that I've asked in the past years, particularly now asking about the God named Yahweh. If God is love, unconditionally, why is he in the Old Testament? Why does he in the Old Testament show partiality? If God is peace, why does he promote killing and murder of innocents? If God doesn't want idols or his people to create things of worship, why does he order these items created for the purpose of worship? The Ark of the Covenant, the temple itself, and its instruments all were created, deemed sacred, like idols were. By the time of Jesus, the divine is completely reframed as Father, as Abba, who is unconditional love, compassionate, forgiving. Jesus even rebukes the religious order about their worship being something that made the word of God powerless. Question. I had this question. When he speaks to the Pharisees and compares his father to theirs, he says, "Your father, the devil." Was he being dramatic? Was it a hyperbole? Or was he referring to their Yahweh? One article I read said, the wickedness of Yahweh's early actions shows the starting point of a long spiritual evolution towards understanding divine goodness. Oh my golly. If this theory says that bad transitions into good, I have never left anything on the counter that like a black banana that turned good. Anything I've left on the counter that should have been refrigerated has always gone from good to unhealthy. Some folk like Carl Jung had other mystic views and say that Yahweh embodies the shadow and light of human nature, and here's his justification. His rage, jealousy mirrors our own collective ego and capacity for violence. His mercy and covenant show the longing to transcend those instincts. I have a question for Mr. Jung. Why do I need to spend time and emotional energy on evil? The premise here is that these Yahweh stories are necessary because they make us confront our inner human contradictions and invite transformation. Maybe they can. But it infers that we will only understand good if we understand bad first. Somehow that's not consistent with the quantum reality that we're learning. What we give our attention to expands. Some say that in literary terms, conflict is essential to revelation. So I have a question. Since when did love flow out of fear? They are not all compatible, and actually, fear cannot exist in the presence of love. Personally, I have a hard time agreeing with the facts that teach that evil of a person shows the potential to love. Focusing on evil gets more evil and sets us up for failure. What we give our attention to expands. Putting evil into our consciousness expands evil. We're learning that what we hold in our consciousness grows. I believe that the ancient narrative that repeatedly depict wrath, violence, or punishment can program the collective psyche towards fear and separation rather than love. Could it be that the answer to fear and violence in the world was given license to exist? Could it exist because the understanding of God's character as a warrior, as violent and vindictive, and therefore punishes and creates war and inflicts pain, is a good thing? If people take the Yahweh stories literally or uncritically, they risk reinforcing a worldview where God is a tyrant, humans are perpetually guilty. That idea expands fear, not Christ consciousness. And this is why many mystics and modern theologians and metaphysical teachers suggest we must read these texts symbolically, not devotionally, not as mirrors involving or evolving awareness, and not as moral templates. So here's a thought as well. All that we fear or repress doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It hides and it gains power. The ancient stories may not be invitations to worship Yahweh's violence, but they are stories that humanity projects onto the divine, which is what is allowed for the violence and wars and atrocities that we have witnessed. Some believe that when consciousness sees its own darkness reflected, it has a chance to reclaim that energy and transform it and choose differently. The danger is that when people stop at the surface level, they never move into transformation. Sacred texts don't evolve. We do. From this vantage point, the old Yahweh archetype is not our teacher. It's a record of where we came from, not where we're going. Reading it with awareness allows us to extract wisdom without expanding fear. I believe if a community continually centers narratives of violence, wrath, or sacrifice, that vibration shapes their world. If we shape focus of stories of healing, inclusion, compassion, the Christ stories, the wisdom of prophets who preached mercy or new revelations through higher consciousness, then we are the ones that reprogram the field. That was the message of Roger Bannister and our little Sophia when we witnessed last week in part 2. It only takes one of us to break through an idea and begin to affect change for many. When we reprogram the universal field of consciousness by what we think, what we do, we, not the governments or religious orders, are responsible for any necessary changes, and we can do it by becoming what we believe we need to see manifest. The shift that is needed is the shift that we are in. That's why many modern spiritual movements now are emphasizing new myth making, telling stories that expand love rather than rehearse trauma. I present this message in honor and respect to anyone who may agree or disagree. What I want to do is to challenge you to continue to search and research. We're in a divine shift to understanding in our personal and intimate relationships with what science calls the universal field of consciousness, what Paul calls in Acts 17 the source, and as Jesus did, and I do too, call God Father. In summary, Yahweh, is he friend or foe? I don't know how many of you are understand or have ever read the Tao Te Ching, but Tao Te Ching actually just means the classic of the way. Tao means the way of virtue. The Tao that cannot be told is not the eternal Tao. That's the first line in the book. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The Tao Te Ching's clearest statement about the name of God is that any name or concept that we use is only a partial reflection of the whole. The true source, the way, God Himself, is beyond words, form, or definition. To name it is to limit it. The name Yahweh is not the oldest name for the divine. It emerged as a particular revelation within Israel's later spiritual development. It was not the name of God from the beginning of human religion. Archaeologically and textually, the name Yahweh first appears around 12,000 to 1000 BCE, much later than the earliest of the Sumerian, Egyptian, or Canaanite gods. Exodus 6, 2 to 3 explicitly says, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, God Almighty, but my name, and then the symbols came, Yod He Vav He, I was not known to them. This verse is the biblical acknowledgement that the name Yod He Vav He was newly revealed at the time of Moses. When it was, that four-letter sacred name was called the Tetragrammaton, and it was given in symbols. It was language that gave them sound. Yod He Vav He, and the Hebrew scribes wrote only consonants. So later, vowels were guessed and produced Yahweh, a name. The meaning is linked to the Hebrew word Hayya, meaning to be or to become. What was to be the breath of life became a personal name. The Tao Te Ching says that many mystics across traditions later echoed, the moment that you name the divine, you've already stepped one step from it. True knowing isn't intellectual, experiential alignment. It's with the flow of the divine itself. The four-letter tetragrammaton carries a deep secret in Hebrew tradition. It's not a word, but it's a pattern of being, a fusion of past, present, and future tenses of the word to be. Haya means was, Hova is, Ihaya will be. So Yod He Vav He means something like that which was, is, and will be the eternal being. If we look at it this way, it's not a name. It relates to a formula for a timeless existence. And in Hebrew mysticism, the true pronunciation of this name is never spoken because to utter it would limit it. And God says, Ayah, Asher, Ayah, I am that I am, or I will be what I will be. So the symbols that have been given breath by its sound is not a name. It describes the cycle of creation itself. Only when we have understanding of each symbol and not put it in a box, and only when we breathe the sound, the ancient sound that all ancient cultures know. Do you know what it is? It's Yah. It's the only sound that is in each culture that is associated with the Most High. When you breathe out the Yah, you will go back to the beginning and remember, because it's not in a box. Fixing on names or doctrines may divide and distort what is inherently unified. The source, the creator, is a subtle, a mysterious whole. And you know what? It can only be felt or lived not intellectually defined. If we cling to the name, we may lose sight of the reality. Mystics and sages say to say to rest in the mystery rather than the description. Here's some questions, and I'm going to answer them right away. Can God be named? Can God be named if by naming it if okay, I'm going to say that again. Can God be named? If God can be named, then naming God limits the limitless. How's that? My question is, what is the source? We know the source, the way, the truth, the light, eternal, formless, nameless. Why do we name God? Why does Jesus call him Father? I believe it's to express the manifestations in the world of form. How should we approach it? With humility, silence, and alignment rather than definition. So we go to the original question. Yahweh, is Yahweh friend or foe? Personally, I've come to the place where I can see that the wickedness of Yahweh isn't divine evil, but it's a distortion of power when consciousness forgets its unity with the source. I believe it's possible to bring the distortion of power back into coherence. And in these last days, it will come into the restoration of all things. The name that can be named is not the eternal nature. In the Tao, those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. Silence in Psalm 65, silence is praise to you. Interpreted mystically as silence itself is the truest form of worship. Naming divides, silence unites. The true name of God is the soundless awareness through which all names arise. Yahweh, friend or foe. I know that it's given you a lot of information. I'm really hoping that as this information gets assimilated, that you'll find yourself wanting to go into the silence, not to know God by names, not even to know only by the characteristics, but to know him personally through experience. And what we're learning is that experience comes in the silence. Okay, I'm opening up our Hollywood Squares. I was going to end with a meditation tonight, but I'd rather, instead of doing that, want to just make a recommendation. My recommendation would be to sit in the silence and really not, you can't have, I don't think, have a guided meditation and be in the silence. It's something that we have to choose, something that we need to choose the silence. We need to choose the purpose of that silence. And so I leave it over to you, and take this subject. Done. And are there any questions?